Movies and TV shows make us think that living in a castle, provided you were one of the nobles, was extremely comfortable and glamorous. But reality was quite far from this bright picture. If you were among the lucky few, the ruling class, you had small privileges like plenty of wine and the occasional hot bath. But other than that, life in a castle was hardly considered comfortable. Daily life was shaped around rigid religious rituals, harsh rules, and brutal punishments. In medieval Europe, plumbing was almost non-existent. There was no running water, nor the luxury of flushing everything away to keep things clean. Waste collected in pits right under the toilets, turning castles into giant latrines. Now imagine this on the hottest day of summer. Maybe that's exactly why everyone in medieval dramas seems so perpetually tense. Moreover, the foul stench didn't just come from there. Since there was no running water, bathing was impossible unless you were extremely wealthy. Because of this, every servant in the castle emitted an unbearable odor, as if soap hadn't touched them for weeks. Furthermore, these people had no money for medicine. Most of the time, they grew accustomed to living with illness, resorted to hearsay solutions, or prayed as their only resort. Speaking of toilets, if you weren't the castle owner, you couldn't expect privacy. When you had a need, you'd sit over one of the side-by-side holes on a long wooden bench, sharing the moment with acquaintances, strangers, and whoever happened to be passing by. And yes, let's remind you again, there was no flush. Everything you did fell into a massive pit of horror inside the castle. Your only wish was that nothing fell out of your pocket, because retrieving something that fell was not exactly a tempting idea. You know how the house suddenly feels cramped when relatives visit for a few days? Not enough seats, a queue for the bathroom, no room to move in the kitchen. Now take that feeling, add dozens more people, and imagine it's permanent, not temporary. That was exactly what living in a castle was like. Countless servants were needed for the daily routine to continue. Add to that the extended family of the lord and lady, their children, cousins, and personal attendants, and the castle stopped being a home and turned into a small, overcrowded city with narrow corridors, endless rushing, and never-ending noise. We've all seen enough fantasy movies and Disney cartoons. We know castles always have a dungeon where criminals, political rivals, or anyone who annoyed the lord was thrown. Movies usually show it as a dark, damp, and creepy room, and leave it at that. But there's a detail the screen specifically skips. These dungeons weren't just waiting rooms. Prisoners were regularly subjected to unimaginable tortures. One of the most common methods involved starved rats. Yes, you heard right. Letting rats gnaw on a prisoner alive was a perfectly normal part of the era's punishment system. It sounds disturbing, but then again, no one in that age expected to enjoy it. Moreover, this wasn't just seen as sadism. According to a common belief, the more a person suffered, the more they were purged of their sins. In other words, torture was considered a method of spiritual cleansing rather than just punishment. This made the phrase, "this is for your own good," one of the creepiest explanations in history. Speaking of rats, fighting them is a problem even today. Now imagine living in a massive, dark, and damp castle without modern traps, poison, or professional pest control. Yes, rats were literally everywhere. And there wasn't much you could do to fix it. A rat infestation was a mundane part of daily life. You'd accept it and move on. You might think people eventually got used to it, but the truth is, a large portion of medieval people were terrified of rats. The reason isn't mysterious. Rats were used in torture and were the primary carriers of the plague, which wiped out nearly half of Europe's population at the time. At this point, it's not hard to understand why the castle residents walked around slightly tipsy all day. Castles weren't just crowded and smelly. Chickens, dogs, and sometimes even pigs roamed freely inside. Animals were a source of both food and warmth, but they significantly added to the smell and chaos. In such an environment, the most practical way to live was to never put down your cup. For lords and ladies, options were plenty: quality wines, beers, special spirits. For servants, it was simpler: whatever was available. Actually, alcohol wasn't a choice. Most of the time, drink was safer than water, because the water was so filthy that it would be considered a potential threat by modern safety standards. In an environment where so much drinking happened, you wouldn't expect anyone to be energetic in the early morning. This might have been true for the lords, but for the servants, it was different. They had to be up as soon as the sun rose. There was no electricity, and castles were dim and dark even during the day. Therefore, the only way to get work done was to use every possible second of daylight. Even if you didn't work in the castle, unless you were rich, you were likely a merchant, artisan, or day laborer. The way to earn money was to wake at dawn. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people liked to be clean. The real problem, however, especially for the lower classes, was that accessing clean water was nearly impossible. This is where the value of plumbing becomes clear. Back then, what we call a bathtub was nothing more than a giant wooden barrel carried from room to room. It wasn't hygienic, it wasn't private, but at least it took away some of that castle smell. Castles were like giant stone basements, completely devoid of insulation. They were built for defense first and foremost, not as a living space. Everything from the walls to the floors was made of ice-cold stone. Windows were few, and those that existed let in almost no light. Lords and ladies were relatively lucky. They lived in rooms with fireplaces and a bit of light, but servants had to squeeze into cold, dark, and disease-ridden areas on the lower floors of the castle. Honestly, if it were me, I'd seriously consider sleeping outside in those conditions. Moreover, things got much worse in the winter months. While fireplaces could only heat a few rooms, everyone else was left alone with the freezing stone walls. Dying of frostbite was not a rare occurrence back then. There was always movement in the castle: celebrations, festivals, visiting nobles. Because of this, grand banquets weren't rare moments, they were part of the daily routine. If you worked in the kitchen, you spent your day preparing for a feast. Then, when the job was done, you'd eat your own simple meal in a corner of the kitchen. At the same time, in the Great Hall, lords and ladies would host their guests at long tables, everyone taking their place according to rank. Important people were seated in the most visible part of the table. Servants, meanwhile, stayed as far back as possible, in corners where they tried to go unnoticed. Because in that era, it was preferred that class differences didn't stand out too much during dinner. Tables were set in the castle's great hall, and your status determined not just where you sat, but what ended up on your plate. While lords and their guests feasted on spicy, fancy, and varied dishes, servants made do with a bowl of soup or a simple pastry in a dim corner. So yes, there was no luxury, but you weren't starving. By medieval standards, that was perfectly sufficient. A huge portion of a town's population, over 80%, consisted of peasants, and most of these people couldn't even step through the castle gates. They worked the land, but first they had to feed themselves and their families. Lords and ladies, on the other hand, dealt with land management, taxes, and endless political bargaining. Thus, they didn't have the luxury of thinking about cooking or the castle's daily chores. Consequently, every castle had a massive army of servants. From cleaning to cooking, from dressing to special requests, everything was their responsibility. Life wasn't easy for anyone, but at least the lords found a chance to catch their breath once in a while. As we mentioned before, castles were stone-walled but not very pleasant-smelling places. To deal with the foul odor, people carried pungent herbs instead of perfume. Lavender or rosemary was like the deodorant of that era. For cleaning, reeds, rushes, and various herbs were spread on the floors. These absorbed spills and at least suppressed the smell a bit, until it was time to clear the old ones. At that moment, it felt like not just a carpet, but all the sins of the past were being unearthed. Spilled beers, grease stains, bones, spit, and animal droppings would suddenly appear. So every place you stepped in the castle was just a floor of filth covered by a thin layer. Honestly, it doesn't sound foreign to me at all. It has a slight university dorm room vibe. Moreover, castles weren't just dirty, they were also unbearably noisy. Stone walls didn't absorb sound, instead they echoed everything back. Coughs, shouts, animal noises, the never-ending din of arguments. True silence almost never existed in a castle. Without microwaves or modern kitchens, all meals were prepared over an open fire. In a structure full of wood and straw, this was a risk in itself. In the early medieval period, kitchens were usually made entirely of wood. Why such a decision was made is still unclear. A single spark could turn the whole kitchen to ash in minutes. Over time, people realized the mistake, and stone kitchens and fixed stoves began to be used. If modern occupational safety rules existed, they would probably give this development a standing ovation. Every castle definitely had a chapel. Along with the Great Hall, it was one of the most important points of the castle. In some castles, the chapel was 2 stories. The lords would stand on the upper level, looking down at the servants below. You could say social distancing was provided by architecture. The Middle Ages was not an easy period. Even under the best conditions, living in a castle wasn't exactly heartwarming. Constant darkness, smell, crowds, and fear. It's not hard to guess how these conditions affected people's psychology. What about you? Would you want to live in a castle like this? Write your thoughts in the comments. And while you're here, be sure to check out the other videos on Medieval Archive.